Deputy Kent, thank you for diligent police work in the nasty business of Chester Barton. It has much unsettled the citizens of Jacksonville.
Well, thank you, Judge. I'm honored. Yes, sir. Tongues are wagging. Barton killed Daniel McMahon, went crazy, and starved to death in jail.
I'm Chester Barton, and I murdered that damn little Irishman McMahon and cheated them gals.
Word was McMahon was well liked, industrious for an Irisher, tended sheep, did no socializing.
Heard McMahon had 1,000 sheep, and I set out to buy 'em with highman carry. But that stubborn sheep herding fool wouldn't sell. But I told Carrie that we'd go back, put that little man out of the way, and drive off them sheep.
Judge, Barton was a most unsavory reputation. Others up Canyonville just disappeared when dealing with Barton.
Carrie and I went back to McMahon's. We all went a-walking, and then, bang! Bang! I shot him in the back of the head. Twice. You know, I killed a lot of other sons of bitches. Anyways, we buried him and drove off them sheep. And if Carrie ain't squat where he laid, they'd nary have found him. And I've been living high off my sheep money.
Much credit to Ryan, the hardware man, who queried McMahon's failure to settle up after the supposed sale of some sheep. He swore out warrants on Barton for larceny and murder.
I was back in Canyonville, tending my sheep, when the Jackson County deputy shows up and arrests me for sheep stealing. I just laugh and says, I ain't stole no sheep, and shows him receipts from McMahon.
Those receipts just didn't seem right to me, which made me more suspicious. I persisted in interrogating, and then I produced a warrant for murder.
Felt like a thunderbolt struck me. Then I asked the deputy, well, have you found the body?
You saw the wrong name on the receipts, taxed Barton for man's Christian name. He replied, Mac, not Daniel.
He seemed quite unnerved when I told him the true name, but he resisted interrogating with great brass. And then Sheriff Livingston arrived with Carrie, with whom Barton was most anxious to converse.
I made cheerful banter onto Jacksonville, but Deputy resisted my parley with Carrie. He's of weak will, but lacking a body, the law's got nothing on me.
Back in Jacksonville, I went to work on Carrie, and he cried a confession to avoid a murder charge. We then found McMahon's body directly.
Your testimony at grand jury hastened Barton's indictment for murder. That Swiss, Peter Britt, was a juror and photographed Barton on incarceration.
Judge, court was uncommon crowded and delayed the trial for months. The jailers advised of Barton's strange behavior, shaking and eye-crossing and talking irrational, and then refusing food.
My deteriorating condition caused great concern among the good people of Jacksonville. Them fearing being cheated the pleasure of seeing me dangled from a rope. Get what I had coming.
Then on, Barton faked, or really was insane. Mayhap the arsenic hidden in his vest and daily taken in short quantity was the cause of his behavior.
In jail, the doc lit a candle under my nose and burned it. Then he gave me chloroform. So wonder he didn't kill me. So wonder I didn't kill him.
Remember Thanksgiving Day? The doctors hid behind a curtain in jail to discover Barton's fakery. When jailer left, he ceased his shaking and fell upon his repast ravenously.
I ate all that delicious dinner. And after, well, I just laid back and picked my teeth.
Ha ha! When the good doctors split the curtain and Barden saw them revealed, he promptly resumed his irrational shaking and trembling.
December opened with Barden's trial. He was much debilitated, carried into court on a mattress. Dr. Callender testified Barden was sane, but his mind was weakened by his physical condition.
Dr. Aiken admitted a relationship between constipation and insanity, but he qualified that not all cases of constipation were necessarily insane.
Oh, that was surely cold comfort to those constipated.
In court, they want to see if I'm sane enough to stand trial. And guess what? They left, voted, and came right back in saying I was sane. But not fit enough to stand trial.
I remember weeks past. Chester Barden, the jury finds you sane, so no asylum for you. But, lacking the ability to assist your own defense, you are remanded to jail, pending further proceedings. Court adjourned.
Fake and sick, I figured I'd escape the noose and be sent to asylum. Damn it, though! A week later, I died. But I said they'd near hang me. And by God, I, Chester Barden, cheated them gallows!
Yes, Barden escaped the noose, but as the Democratic Times said, in doing so, he suffered a death 1,000 times worse.
Barden was buried in Jacksonville Cemetery's pauper's ground. Ryan made space and a marker in his family block for poor McMahon.
Come on, George. Yep. Hello, I'm Mrs. Louise Mueller. My husband Max and I come from Germany. Max was one of the first successful Jewish businessmen in Jacksonville. He arrived in Southern Oregon in 1855 and opened his first dry goods shop just 3 years later. Soon other Jewish families began to arrive. Many were merchants and had some of the best shops in town. Well, one such was Max's good friend Gustav Krajewski. Gustav arrived also in 1855 and settled out in the Applegate Valley where he had a farm before opening his shop, Krajewski Agricultural Implement Barn, in 1869. Well, soon after this, one of Gustav's very close friends, Bernard Levy, died suddenly, leaving a young widow and 4 young daughters. Well, Gustav offered her friendly advice and support, and they soon grew quite close and eventually married. We were so happy for the young family. And Gustav did quite well with his shop and his farm and orchard and even a flour mill. Well, the story I wish to share with you today is about one of their daughters, Stella Levy. She is a lovely, though somewhat simple young girl who later in her life some considered a town character. Well, as a very young woman, she worked at the Jackson County Courthouse, where my Max was county clerk and treasurer. And she was even a member of the Eastern Star. That's an independent chapter of the Masons who allowed both men and women. Well, Stella never married, and there were those in town who said, "Oh, poor Stella." But you know, I think it was by choice. You see, when her parents passed away, she inherited the house, a 72-acre farm and orchard, and even some warehouse property, so she was quite comfortable financially and did not need to marry. Well, as I said, as she got older, she did develop some very unusual habits. For instance, she would not leave her yard. She said that when she went to town, the young men made comments about her figure. I wish they made comments about my figure. But she paid the schoolboys a dime to take her orders to the mercantile or to the post office. And though she was unmarried and stayed close to home, Stella was by no means a lonely woman. No, she had her bunny. Oh, how she loves that dog. I think perhaps a little too much. You see, Stella showed her love with food. And, well, I think Bunny may have died from too much good Jewish cooking. Well, she eventually got another dog, also named Bunny, and had pet chickens and many devoted friends, such as myself. Well, there were whispers about her little oddities, but there was nothing that happened in Jacksonville that Stella did not hear about. No, she spent hours a day at her gate, going over the local events and gossip with her friends and neighbors who passed by. Well, Stella passed away in 1936 at the age of 75, and she lived through some of Jacksonville's most colorful history and was part of a young, exciting community. She was the last of her family to maintain the faith, and she was the last direct descendant of a Jewish family to be buried here in the cemetery. Unfortunately, at the time of her death, there was no rabbi in all of Southern Oregon to perform the traditional Jewish burial rites. So Reverend Millard of the Presbyterian Church said a eulogy at her gravesite. I think perhaps at the request of the Eastern Star ladies. Well, I know she would have preferred to have a traditional Jewish burial. I am just as sure that she would have appreciated the fine efforts of the community she was so fond of. Thank you.
Back in my time, it was only proper for a lady to be mentioned in the newspaper twice in her life. Once when she married, and once when she died. Well, I was actually mentioned a third time. I don't know how proper that is, but it was 150 years after the event. A man named Bill Miller wrote about me just last year in the Mail Tribune. The moonlight ride of John and Sarah. Jacksonville's townfolk, wrapped snugly under their covers, snored as their clocks ticked off the minutes between 1 and 2 a.m. Suddenly, racing hoofbeats pounded down the hill and onto California Street. The hysterical shouts of a half-crazed man cutting into the night. "Help! Help!" he screamed, his voice echoing into the hills. "Stop them! Clear the road!" Was it a fire? An Indian attack? Was someone murdered? The instantly awakened townfolk rushed out in their night clothes to the stables on the corner of 4th Street. One resident even arrived buck naked, carrying a club and wearing only cowboy boots and spurs. The man who was yelling was chasing a young girl who was screaming, "No, Papa, no!" That's when they recognized Walter Matney, an Applegate Valley farmer who had finally quartered his daughter, Sarah Jane Matney, and her beau, John Oyler. The town marshal arrested Matney, along with Sarah and Oyler. Promising to leave peacefully if he could just take his daughter home, Matney began begging for his release. The lawman refused. That's when the couple showed him a marriage certificate proving that they had been married the previous evening. The three were released, a saddened Matney left for home, and the bride and groom retired to the nearby U.S. hotel. Well, now you may be wondering why my pa was making such a fuss. My ma and pa did not think it was proper for a 46-year-old man to be courting their 13-year-old daughter. Well, John and I were so in love. We decided to elope. So I knew that my ma and pa would be visiting the neighbors on Sunday evening. I was in charge of my younger siblings, so I made them supper, got them into bed, and when all my chores were done and it was quiet, I put on my shawl and I went out to meet John, who had horses waiting, and we rode over to Phoenix, where we were properly married at the home of a friend. Well, we were so happy and pleased that our plan had worked that we didn't expect my father to come up yelling when we got back to Jacksonville, and I certainly did not expect to be arrested on my wedding night. Well, as fate would have it, John and I were happy for a few months here in Jacksonville, but then we decided it would be better if we moved to Southern California. A few years later, actually quite a few years later, John and I were divorced, but not until we'd had 10 children. And I later remarried a man named William Cochran. That was 1881. and we had 4 more children. Well, in 1926, I was mentioned one more time in the newspaper, this time properly in my obituary. Thank you.
Oh, look, Jessie, we're not the only people visiting in the cemetery tonight, after all. Normally you would find us at our earthly resting place in Vacaville, California Cemetery. I'm Lavinia Robinson, and this is my husband, Dr. Jesse Robinson. I'm sure you've heard of the Robinsons.
Well, we're the other Robinsons. Dr. James Robinson and I, we were both medical doctors, and he practiced medicine here in Jackson County. But I ran the Robinson House here in Jacksonville, where the U.S. Hotel stands today.
Well, I know we're not related to them, those other Robinsons, but I am related to some pretty famous pioneers here in Jacksonville, the Constants and the Merrimans. And that's who we're here to visit tonight.
This could take a while. This cemetery's full of your relatives, 16 at last count.
Well, Jesse, before we talk about my relatives, maybe you'd like to tell our friends something about your life.
Well, I graduated from medical school in Vermont at the age of 23, practiced medicine for a while, but the lure of gold brought me to the West. I did some mining, didn't strike it rich, and moved to Shasta County and was elected their first clerk. Not long after that, I became a cattle rancher out near Wairika in the Scott Valley. So that was 4 careers in as many years, and I was not in any mood to be settling down.
Oh, Jesse, before we talk about your other careers, I want to tell about my relatives. My father was Isaac Constant, and my mother was Lucinda Merriman. You've all heard of Merriman Road in Central Point, haven't you? Well, my father went west from Illinois, first for his health, but then he participated in the gold rush, and he must have done well because he came back in 2 years and packed us all up and headed west.
Oh, you don't know how many times I've heard this story before.
Well, Father built 5 strong, watertight wagons for our family, and then the people of the wagon train elected him to be captain of the entire train. We made it across the country on the Oregon Trail to his Central Point ranch in only 5 months.
Now, 1853, I operated the Robinson House, a fine hotel and boarding house downtown on California Street. Career number 5.
Well, on April 27th, 1854, Jesse and I were married. Our marriage was one of the very first ones recorded in all of Jackson County.
Now, 1854 was a good year indeed. I had a new bride, my hotel business was doing well, and I had an interest in a grits mill, a sawmill, some mining claims, and a packing company.
But he just couldn't settle down. He sold his interest in the hotel, and he bought the old Alonzo Skinner donation land claim in Central Point. Career number 6 by then. But it was right next to my parents' property, and so we settled down, and we had 5 children while we lived there.
Well, then the Civil War broke out, and I served as a first lieutenant in the Baker's Guard, 1st Union Cavalry of Oregon. And I didn't return home again until the fighting ended in 1865.
Career number 7. Well, by then, our children were growing, and we really wanted them to have a good education, so we moved again, this time to Oakland, California, and we had one more child.
Well, there I served as the Oakland Township Assessor for 6 years. And then we were on the move again. Finally, our last move to a fruit orchard in Solano County, where we lived together until my passing in May of 1899.
Finally, we finally got that man to settle down and stay in one place. Well, it was 30 years later before I joined Jesse in the Vacaville Elmira Cemetery. I was 97 years old.
We had better be moving along if we're going to visit all these famous pioneer relatives of yours here tonight. And you had better be moving along too. Good night.
Well, here we are again, Mary, in Jacksonville, where we're both buried and where we first came west as pioneers. I guess you could say we've come full circle. Well, hello everyone. My name is George Brown, and this wonderful lady here is my wife, Mary Jane.
George and I were both born in England, as you might be able to tell, and came here to America as children with our families. It was only years later that we met and married in Wisconsin.
In 1852, my two brothers, Henry and Robert, came west, sailing around Cape Horn and up the west coast of South America. Robert had his eyes on Astoria, where he settled and built the first wharf. Henry staked a claim on Sterling Creek. Later he staked a claim on Little Butte Creek and settled among the Rogue Indians. Chief Jake and his band watched over Henry's cabin and his horses. Henry worked as a hunter, supplying meat to the miners. In 1854, Henry's claim was settled. It was 1 mile southeast of the center of Brownsboro, which of course is named after our brother Henry. By buying up the claims of other homesteaders, Henry increased his claim to 2,800 acres.
Well, that's a grand total indeed, George. 10 years later, in 1862, Henry returned for a visit to Wisconsin and was so enthusiastic about the opportunities that presented themselves here in Oregon that we just had to come and see for ourselves. So, let me see. George's two brothers, Henry and William, Henry's wife, Martha, their sister Annie and her husband, William, my mother-in-law, Cecilia, George and I and our firstborn, little Emily, all came west with the wagon train.
That was quite a trip. Mr. James Beasley, who was on the wagon train, couldn't return to Wisconsin soon enough. He referred to this area as God-forsaken, where all you could see was mountains. But unfortunately, Mr. Beasley died of diphtheria before he could go back east. When I arrived here, I staked a claim at Rich Gulch, and I worked as a butcher and as a carpenter.
Eventually, Robert left Astoria for Brownsboro. And then in 1873, Henry bought the store there from John Bilger, and Brown's, a general merchandising store, was born. Robert and Henry ran the store together for 2 years, and then Henry sold his share to Robert. Eventually, Robert decided that Eagle Point was the place to be and closed the Brownsboro store, only to open Brown's general merchandise across the street from the Butte Creek Mill.
Robert ran the store for 7 years, and then he sold it to me. And that's how we made our way to Eagle Point and became the proud owners of the store.
But not before George had made his mark in Jacksonville, serving as chairman of the Jackson County Republican Committee, and also as a Jackson County Commissioner. He also donated money and materials to help build the first schoolhouse in Eagle Point. Some of the local citizens decided that as the school was close to the creek, there was no need to build any toilet facility for the pupils. Well, they could just use the bushes. It would be cheaper. But George was adamant, and eventually a sturdy outhouse stood under the willow trees.
Mary, do you remember the storehouse we built alongside the store and across from the mill?
Of course I do, George. It had water running underneath it to keep our merchandise cool on those hot summer days.
That building is still standing today and is considered to be a historic landmark in Jackson County.
Well, it's a wonderful tribute to the whole family, George.
Frank and William worked in the store with me. Frank eventually became the mayor of Eagle Point, and William became the founder of First State Bank, and he served as its president for 39 years. Frank's wife, Amy, was the librarian in Eagle Point for 25 years, and Charlotte served as the first Eagle Point operator at the telephone exchange.
Oh yes, the Browns were a prominent Eagle Point family and contributed greatly to the growth of the city. Oh, George, do you remember that Indian who used to come in the store and buy tobacco?
And A.F. Ragsdale, who sold us butter, and W.W. French, who raised wheat for us to sell.
Oh, you know, I can still see those horses pawing the frozen ground as their breath steamed in the air, while their owners were inside, gossiping round the wood stove while their wives shopped. Oh, George, what a pleasant and warm place our store was.
Such wonderful memories, dear friends, and wonderful children.
Yes, 11 of them, 5 boys and 6 girls. I passed away on April 22nd, 1908, shortly before my 73rd birthday, and what would have been our golden wedding anniversary.
I passed away in 1910 at age 77, but unfortunately, it was before I could see the new store that was built on Main Street in Eagle Point. William's wife, Maddie, after his death, ran the store with her nephew, W.L. Van Scoy, until 1954, when the store was sold.
A-N-G-E-L. Y'all will probably say angel. Everybody does. But believe me, I was no angel. I was Martin Angle. And like the marker says, I was killed by Indians. So, how did I earn that epitaph? Well, we come here in 1852, my wife Anna and me, to farm our donation land claim, raise a family, become upstanding citizens. We staked our claim and was prepared to defend it, even if it meant killing Indians. See, them was difficult times. Way back to the 1830s, what with the incoming settlers and the Indians trading in violence against one another. It was what led to the rogue Indian wars of the 1850s. I can't say as I totally blame the Indians for everything that happened. They'd been here a spell, had their own ways, weren't too keen on us coming in and acting like we owned the place. But we did own the place, by God. It was our manifest destiny to own it. And the U.S. government wrote us this deed to prove it. Now I know the whites killed a heap of Indians. But it's also true they killed innocent women and children. Certainly, I killed me my share of Indians. Right from the doorway of our home sometimes as they flew by on their horses. Lots of the local farmers got involved when things got hot. There was rumors flying everywhere, and we didn't have time to figure out what was true or not. If we thought our families was in danger, we did what we had to get to protect them. It was kill or be killed. Well, it was one day of killing in particular what got me in trouble. August 1853 it was. Oh, things was bad. Houses was being fortified, businesses closed. Folks was mighty enraged. And some of us set out to hunt down them Indians what caused all the trouble. Well, when I rode back to town after fighting Indians all day, I come upon a mob at the bottom of the hill here, California and Oregon streets. They had already hanged 2 Indians that day, and now they had an 8-year-old boy and was fixing to hang him. Had a noose around his neck. A calmer-headed citizen, Mr. B.F. Dial, stepped in, cut the rope, tried to take the boy. Well, the crowd took him back and put another rope around his neck. And he cut that one too. Well, the mob was getting frustrated and they was fixing to let the boy go. Well, this is where my anger and my frustration betrayed my gentle name, A-N-G-E-L. I rode up to that mob and I yelled, "Hang him! Hang him! He'll make a murderer when he's growed!" They listened to me. Y'all can think what you want. I tried to be a good neighbor, a kind husband and father. Y'all don't believe me? 3 years later, they elected me president of the County Board of Commissioners. And that road out of town, y'all call it Highway 238? It was us commissioned the initial construction all the way to Crescent City. Killed by Indians. 3 miles out on that road it happened. They ambushed me. 4 bullets to the head and neck. I guess the sins of my past finally caught up to me. Right out on that road where I helped get built. They say what goes around comes around. Well, I can tell you this. From my experience, that's pretty much the truth. But like I said, them was difficult times. And besides, they was different times than now. Or was they?
I'll see you on Friday. Okay, good. I'll look forward to it.
Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Kent, District Attorney for Jacksonville. The story you're about to hear today occurred in the fall of 1881 in Jacksonville. Now, Jacksonville is no longer just a mining camp in the wilderness where brute force or vigilante justice might prevail over the rule of law. Now, if you are accused of a crime, you will have the benefit of a trial and a verdict by a judge and jury. Justice under the law is what we aim for, but is not always achieved, which brings me to an unpleasant task that I need to perform. Over here is standing Mrs. Rebecca Shannon, wife, mother of 3 children, whose husband, Matt Shannon, was shot to death in a fight on the streets of Jacksonville less than 2 months ago. As district attorney, it is my duty to prosecute the defendant, Mr. Dan Courtney, for manslaughter. After a long and contentious trial, the verdict is now in, and I have to inform Mrs. Shannon that her husband's killer was found not guilty on the grounds of self-defense. Mrs. Shannon, I need to talk with you. Mrs. Shannon, I'm deeply sorry, and I regret to inform you that on the 3rd and final ballot, 5 of the jurors changed their minds from conviction And now all 12 jurors came to the verdict that Dan Courtney is not guilty on the grounds of self-defense.
What? Not guilty? How can this be? Courtney is guilty. He shot my Matthew in the head in a fist fight. I know that Matt struck the first blow, but Courtney had wronged us. Oh, this is just too much. First, Matt's Jacksonville blacksmith shop burns down. And then we're saddled with Courtney's debts when we take over the Soda Springs Hotel when he couldn't make a go of it. Courtney cheated Matt, and then he killed him. The jury says he's not guilty. This is madness. Where is the justice?
Mrs. Shannon, you'll never be able to understand this. I mean, I'm so sorry that this happened.
What do I tell my children? Their father is dead while the murderer still walks the streets of Jacksonville? What was the jury thinking?
You know, Mrs. Shannon, I did my best to show the jury that this was not an equal contest. You know, it's true that your husband struck the first blow. He was angry, but he had no idea that Courtney was carrying a concealed revolver. Courtney could have walked away with a few bruises. Instead, he chose to shoot and kill. Everything I did was to show the jury that it was not a fair fight.
It was not a fair fight. Courtney was armed, and it was not a fair trial. My husband's dead and his killer walks away?
You know, Mrs. Shannon, we will never know all of the emotions, all of the forces that affect a jury. I mean, a preacher once said you get justice in the next world, and in this world, you get the law. I had some questions about the defense team. I mean, how could Courtney afford to have one of the best criminal defense lawyers in the whole state of Oregon? You know, a man from Portland who recently lost a congressional seat to a Democrat. I'm a Democrat, my law partner were Democrats. It almost seemed like there was some kind of a political vendetta going on at the expense of justice.
But couldn't they see that Courtney was a bad seed? He was a scoundrel. I mean, he stole cattle. He had no friends. No one would even put up his bail money. And he doesn't even get a slap on the wrist. Well, I don't know how I'm going to feed my children. And I couldn't even bury my husband without the help of charity.
You know, Mrs. Shannon, we will never know why they changed their minds. You know, they said that Courtney had the right to defend himself. I really thought that editorial that came out, you know, right after the killing from the Oregon Sentinel, the editor was so strong in saying that, you know, we got to stop the violence, stop the killing, stop the heartache that's caused by men carrying concealed weapons. Weapons that are lethal, readily available in the heat of an argument. You know, so many lives would have been saved otherwise. Lives like that of your husband, Matt Shannon. Well, time has moved on. It's only fair to say that Dan Courtney's wife died a painful death of cancer a few weeks before the shooting. Therefore, he may not have been in his right mind. Right after the trial, he moved to Roseburg, where he remarried and died there in 1912. Mrs. Shannon remarried about a year after her husband's death. She was widowed again, and then she spent the last 45 years of her life living with her daughter in Medford, where she died in 1943. For me, I think the supreme irony of this case is the fact that this tragedy took place right outside of a hardware store in Jacksonville that had the motto, "Live and let live." Live and let live. Is that really too much to ask?
Well, hello. I'm Adelaide Colvig. I'm sure glad to be in Jacksonville again. I met some of you when I was here last year, but this time I brought along my youngest son, Vance. Though you might not recognize him by that name, you may actually have heard of him. He was quite famous as Bozo the Clown. I think he favored his father's family.
My mama, she covered me with a crazy quilt when I was born, and I've been clowning ever since.
Vance was born in 1892 and raised in Jacksonville. He was the last of 7 otherwise normal children.
My father, William, was an attorney. but the townsfolk referred to him as the judge. But he said the only judging I'd ever done was judging a glass of whiskey.
Our house was on South Oregon Street. You may know it because it still stands today. I believe that when the Colvigs moved into that beautiful home, our Lord must have said, "Welcome, and bless ye who enter here," because a whole heap of living went on in that grand old place.
That's sure true, Mama. I spent the first 13 years of my life in this small town, but what a town it was. Perfect to grow up in. In fact, I would often play hooky from school and sleep between the pines and madrones up in the back of this very graveyard.
Before being known as Bozo, everyone called Vance Pinto because of his freckles. And that name stuck. For the rest of his life, he was Pinto Colvig. Compared to his brothers and sisters, he was quite unusual, to say the least.
That's sure true, Mama. I was a bit of a problem child in so many ways. In fact, at the age of 9, I was about 5 feet tall, fat as a bandsaw, and had a head of unruly hair that went every time a comb tried to do its duty. My appearance really hasn't changed. I was always looking for attention, and I couldn't help but find it, as often I was seen riding around town on the back of a cow.
You were a puzzle, Pinto. So let's give these nice folks the pieces. The first piece was music. You and your brother Don were members of the Jacksonville Silver Cornet Band. You were very talented, but couldn't read a lick of music.
I used to sneak down to the local bar known as Al's Den of Inequity, where I would listen to records played on the only phonograph in town.
Oh, yes, Pinto. Your father and I were quite aware that you hobnobbed around town, played horseshoes, bumped chewing tobacco, and entered into whittling contests with various citizens of our small town. What was the mother to do?
Jacksonville had a wide assortment of old codgers of various description: tall, short, fat, skinny, bewhiskered, and bent. I reckon it hasn't changed very much.
The next piece of your puzzle was the stage. Do you remember that long yellow show car that used to come to Jacksonville every fall? Free medicine shows also flocked to Jacksonville back then, like flies to a lump of sugar.
My first real speaking part on the stage was just 2 words, "Duck it," in a play staged at the U.S. Hotel in Jacksonville. I was just a kid. All these events and others led me into show business, and much later, a lifelong career in Hollywood.
And then there was the circus. It was a trip with your father to the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Expo in Portland that changed everything for you.
I approached a carnival barker outside of the Crazy House at the expo, who was dressed as a clown, and I told him that I played the clarinet, and that every time I tried to reach the high notes, I couldn't help being cross-eyed.
The next day he had on clown white for the first time and spent the rest of the stay in Portland on the Midway performing for the crowd. He was just 12 years old, but his fate was sealed.
I was the original Bozo the Clown, although many others followed me in that role, including my son, Vance Jr. I worked for many years for Walt Disney and was the voice of Goofy and Pluto, as well as the voice of several of the dwarves in his Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. It was a wonderful life, and it all started in Jacksonville. I return here often to visit my home, the members of my family, and to remember my boyhood in this wonderful place. I do hope you have an enjoyable visit.
Good afternoon. My name's Fletcher Linn. Allow me to introduce my charming wife, Louise.
I am Louise Sawyers Linn.
But I call her Lulu.
You may also call me Lulu, since we're sharing our life story. That makes us like close friends and family, don't you think? Fletcher and I met in Eugene. I was a music teacher at the University of Oregon. We married in 1892. Goodness, Fletch, we've been married over 58 years.
They've been happy years. After I graduated from the University of Oregon, I immediately followed my father's footsteps. I went into the furniture business.
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Fletcher's father, David Linn, was the first carpenter here.
Father arrived in Jacksonville in the early 1850s, and as he had put it, the last thing Jacksonville needed was another gold miner. So he immediately set up shop using all the tools he'd hauled from Ohio and began making things that the miners and settlers could use. Sluice boxes for mining, simple housing for the newcomers, necessary pieces of furniture.
And coffins, so you can see that David Linn did very well.
Later he built the Pink Presbyterian Church, and he opened a 2-story furniture factory on the corner of Oregon and California Street, making beautiful pieces of furniture from local woods and rosewood from England.
I still admire the pie safe Fletcher's father fashioned for their cousins, the Beekmans. You all can see it in the Beekman House kitchen to this day.
I have fond family memories, growing up with cousins nearby. Had a wonderful childhood, full of adventure. In the summers, my brothers and I would cut timber and haul it to my father's mill. And I recall the time my family, along with several neighbors, took a trip to Crater Lake in 1869, 30 years before it became a national park. My father had constructed a boat in sections. We took the boat with us and assembled it at the lake. We were the first settlers to launch a boat into Crater Lake. We talked about that adventure at family gatherings for years.
And your cousin Carrie Beekman still laughs about the camping trip you and your friends took to Crater Lake 20 years later.
Yeah, another adventure. Due to forest fires, we had to go to the lake by way of Klamath Falls. That gave us the opportunity to visit Fort Klamath. My father built Fort Klamath, you know.
Yes. Fletcher and his father both had diverse businesses. Fletcher was president of the Oregon Furniture Manufacturing Company that employed 300 men, and he was head of numerous companies, served on many boards, and was a trustee to several colleges. His father was so proud. I am too.
Thank you, my dear. You know, Father was very proud to have you as a daughter-in-law. Think of all you brought to the Linn family. University of Oregon music teacher, a soprano soloist. You organized art classes at the Portland Art Museum.
We've had a delightful and rewarding life together.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, and after retirement, Fletcher began writing his memoirs. They give us some of the only information we have on early Jacksonville settlers.
You know, born and raised here, I wrote of those early families from memory. Some have questioned my memory and the accuracy of my writing.
Oh, pooh, we know your diary entries were accurate. All those funny details recorded daily. Think of your Crater Lake camping diary. That long list of supplies, 30 loaves of bread, a fine marble cake.
2 Winchester rifles and a shotgun. And that fierce fight with the badger. There's badger and quail on the dinner menu that evening.
And campfire games, chess, checkers, a deck of authors, cards for whist.
And I recall we met 92 Indians, all friendly, just back from huckleberry picking.
Their own huckleberry pies made right in camp.
And those narrow wagon trails. There was no Highway 62. That trip took 17 days. Now it takes 1.
Imagine. Fletcher also compiled a book on historic homes in Jacksonville. Like Peter Britt, we know so much about those early days.
Sadly, I lost my Lulu in 1950. She was 79. I passed 3 years later at 87. We now rest with my family and siblings above a town that I loved.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.